Hopefully now you have an idea around how education might fit in or benefit your organization. And I apologize if there's some sound. There's a wood shop next to me. Now let's talk about the how of education. Let's talk about the recipe to make educational programming happen in your space. And before we get into it, it's important to note that you might build out your educational programming differently than other lending libraries, and that's okay. All of these ingredients are variable depending on your capacity. We do recommend that you consider each one an important player in creating a sustainable and successful and impactful program. We'll get into each of these individual ingredients, but just so you can see the whole before we get started, these are the following things that we think make up successful workshops. After, of course, you figure out what your community needs are. So there are people, the curriculum, the space and tools, student management systems, assessment, and of course, capital. And
People, as you may have guessed, are maybe the most important part of this recipe. They're the reason we're doing this and also the reason that we can do these programs. For the programming side of things, people can come in many forms. There are the instructors. These are the people who are actually running the classes, staff, which can fit in many ways, and the many support roles that go along with these programs. How instructors interact with these programs can look many different ways. They can be paid staff, volunteers, contractors. Each of these roles can be a very viable option, but they each come with some considerations. For volunteers, there might need to be incentives for them to teach or strong systems in place that make it easy for them to get involved. If they're paid staff, you have to consider the amount of working hours and budget that you're working with. And the same goes for the contractors, as well as thinking about tax considerations that might go along with hiring contractors. You also have to consider the roles that the instructors are going to be playing in the logistics and operations of classes. They can be split in many ways, anything from handling everything for a class, from scheduling, creating sign-up systems for students, gathering materials and teaching it, to just being teachers. And that's all they do. Or more likely, some balance of in between the two, where they're collaborating with staff or other volunteers to work through all the logistical details. Besides the instructors involved with these classes, there are also the staff hours that will go into all the logistics and setting up classes and how things are divided among the people. Are there going to be dedicated hours for educational programming for your staff? The labor load can be very different depending on who you're working with and what type of classes you're trying to do. As an example, Seattle Economy has one staff member using about 5 to 10 hours a week to run a small education program. This includes setting up new classes, finding instructors, creating partnerships with other organizations, communicating with instructors, handling the class logistics like scheduling. We have another part-time employee doing marketing, which ties heavily into education programming. And almost all of our teachers are volunteers who facilitate the classes as well as run our workshop. In total, we run about 1 to 2 workshop orientations, a few open hours in our shop, and then a few other classes a month. In contrast, Jen, do you want to talk about Station North?
yeah, sure. So, like I mentioned, I'm one of 4 full-time staff, and my role is dedicated to educational programming. So my, 40 hours a week is going into writing policy, creating new classes, and other educational programs. Also onboarding and communicating with teachers, handling class logistics and purchasing materials, handling enrollment and student inquiries, and scheduling. And then as well as me working on that, I have another coworker who is maybe half of his time is also dedicated to helping classes run, like prepping class materials and making sure the space is up and running. And then my other coworker spends some portion of her time doing budgeting for class related programs. It's a lot of us working together to make this happen. But SNTL runs like a very robust educational programming, and it's the biggest portion of our internal revenue stream. So like I mentioned earlier, it's I think at this point it's like 32 classes, 30 plus teachers, and we run classes almost every day of the week except for Fridays and Sundays. Sundays we run open shop programming in our spaces, and we tend to run, if we can get there, 3 classes each evening. So, it's quite a lot of classes in 1 week.
Yeah, so there can be a lot of different ways to do these additional programs, from, very small setup to a very large and robust system. And not one system is going to work perfectly for everyone's space, and there's a lot of variability there. Some other roles that we kind of touched on already are the support roles. These include the marketing, like I mentioned, or graphic design for posters or different events, community liaisons between the community members and your organization, as well as other roles that deal with like logistics, operations, budgets, and all of those things for running the programs. There's a ton of invisible labor within the scheduling and all of the classes stuff. So really make sure there's enough people power to complete all these roles, as well as the work being divided in a way that makes sense for the workloads within your staff and volunteers.
This next slice of the recipe is all about developing curriculum for your workshops. And so I found that finding a model and a process is the best way to create classes so that all of your classes that throughout your organization feel cohesive to your members. So creating a structure for your classes is the first step. This will give you boundaries to work within and boxes to check as you work on curriculum development. Your structural model may be different from other lending libraries, but they may include setting a length for your workshops and a time that best suits your members' availability and capacities to stay engaged. It could also include identifying and designing classes to meet accessible goals within that time frame that you've allotted. This may mean that you might need to focus on only a few aspects of a broader topic, or run workshops in multiple sessions to be able to accommodate complicated processes. Designing the curriculum to create moments of interactivity that allow many different types of learners to engage in the class is super important. You want to be able to meet the needs of all types of learners. So that might be auditory, visual, experiential learning. This may mean creating activities that allow students to apply new skills towards a project. Having teaching aids is always helpful and gives learners a lot of context, or take homes that allow them to refer back to for future projects. At Station North Tool Library, we have two types of classes that we offer. We host skill-based classes and project-based classes. And even in the skill-based classes, we try to work in some interactive stuff. But basically, students can learn concepts and processes in our skill-based classes, and then they can apply them in our project-based classes. Accessibility is a big one, and it means a lot of different things. Not only are you designing curriculum that meets the needs of different types of learning modalities, but you're also designing classes to be accessible to folks who speak different languages. You might need physical aids for people to participate and understand concepts. And you need to think about, is your workshop space easy to navigate? Do you have proper wayfinding in place so that people can feel at ease while in your workshop? So identifying target audience, this will inform the design, the design of your curriculum even further. So are you tailoring to beginners who may need concepts broken down pretty far? This might mean that you focus those goals even smaller. Are you working with youth? This is something that takes a lot of figuring to make sure that you're both legally accountable for youth in your space, but also that you're creating valuable classes with youth brains in mind. It's a whole can of worms, and honestly, we would suggest that you have a specialized person to work with youth programming in your organization. More people power. Similarly, working with elderly folks presents other challenges that you might want to consider when you're designing your workshops. Like maybe the classes are shorter, or you make sure that there are plenty of breaks and that you have assistance for these folks. Similarly, working with folks with disabilities. So in that case, you may need to structure your workshop drastically differently to accommodate these special needs. Another thing to consider is, how does your curriculum get written and how does it get tested? So this relates again back to people power and having capacity to run this program. Does a staff person write all of the curriculum and review it, or do teachers do this? Or is it a combination of both, like Barrett mentioned earlier? So having a process and a template for writing curriculum will ensure the consistency in your program, as well as define whose role is what and who is accountable for what. You also need to consider how to test your curriculum and gather feedback. So at Station North Tool Library, we run prototype classes before offering them to the public. These prototypes are free and open to the volunteers of our library, which is a perk of being a volunteer. And we ask that as they take the class, they provide feedback during and after the class so that we know how we might need to adapt the curriculum before we release it to the public. And prototypes also let teachers get comfortable with the content and especially with the pacing of the class so that we know that it fits in within the time frame that we've allotted for it. The last thing that we'll discuss is what systems do you use for gathering and preparing class materials? Another tie to people power here. Who is responsible for actually making sure the class is ready to run? So tools and materials will need to be gathered. And there may be some amount of prep that goes into making sure that your students are set up for success, whether that's like making sure the space is clean and organized and all the tools run and the materials are prepped for them. So defining whose roles these are is really crucial to make sure that your curriculum is sustainable for your organization.
Another big consideration is the physical space you're working with and the tools that are going to be involved for each of these classes. This is a fairly straightforward part of our recipe and is very dependent on, your physical space and what you have available. But these are some things to think about as you move forward. Will the programs that you're going to be doing be on site? Do you have a space that can be a workshop or a multi-purpose space? What type of classes will be able to be there? How many people can fit into these spaces? Are there any lease considerations to think about, such as no automotive classes or a building capacity? There also can be limitations based off your insurance. So just things to think about. Are there amenities to set up? Bathrooms, AC, slotting, sink, parking? Um, if you're considering having on-site classes, how can you create a space itself that lends itself to programming overlap? Can you have two programs going on at the same time, or even have your lending library open as well? Having two programs running at the same time, whether that is the library and a class or two additional educational programs, may give exposure to your other program to the attendees. So this can be done by just having people walk through one space to get to where their class is. In addition to exposure, it may allow people to get more comfortable with this space and expand what classes they're interested in taking. Another consideration that I'm sure you're all familiar with by now is virtual events and learning. There can be many benefits of virtual events and classes, especially when your space itself might not lend itself to on-site classes. Some considerations here are what type of software you'll use. Are they going to be recorded or open sourced? What type of workshops will you be able to host on here? You can also consider offsite spaces. So these can be public spaces or partnerships with other organizations that might have a space that's available for you. And these can be a great way to work around these space limitations. And partnerships can also be done virtually. They can be used to spread the work that you're doing to new communities. And that can be an added benefit of getting new members into your organization. And when you're considering using an offsite space, be sure to think about the intention around the location or the partnership. If it's going to be in a public space, is there a fee or a reservation needed? Are you going to need an offsite facilitator that's going to need to be communicated with? Will you need to bring certain tools, or are they going to be provided? Will there be consumables? Who's going to be bringing all these things? And then how much of an investment are you going to be making in these classes? Is it going to be a one-time thing, or is it going to be a class that you're planning to run a lot? And that can be a big determiner of how much energy you want to put into it. There's a lot of creative ways to get around space limitations if you don't have a on-site spot that is available for these classes. So just consider all these other options, and I'm sure there's more than this as you're going forward.
Yeah, once you have a location and the resources and the plan or the curriculum for how you want to run classes, you also need to figure out how participants will be engaging and fill the class or workshop that you're posting. So there are tons of ways for you to go about doing this, but the three buckets to think about here are: what interface do you use to host enrollment? How do you market classes? And how do you provide support to folks who are engaging with your classes or workshops? Interface, this would allow participants to be notified about an event. They can sign up for it and potentially pay for the class. There are a lot of options again on what interface you might be using, but what you want to look for is it easy for both a potential participant to use, and is it easy for your teachers or other staff who might be posting the event to use? Does it have payment processing if you plan to require some form of payment for your classes? And with this, it's important to note that you know any processing fees that might come with this. Similarly, does this software require a subscription to use? If so, make sure your annual budget can hold that cost. Does the software collect demographic data or provide other analytics around member usage? This can be super helpful to understand the trends that inform your programming, and it can even connect you further with your members, and especially if you can see their journey through woodworking or whatever their interaction with your organization may be. At the Tool Library, at the Station North Tool Library, we use a program called MindBody, which is a software that a lot of gyms use to process both membership to the library as well as post and charge for classes. It's an expensive software, and it does a lot of things, but it also doesn't do a lot of things. So we're kind of in a moment where we're actually exploring changing softwares. But Barrett, can you talk a little bit about what Seattle uses?
Yeah, we use Eventbrite, which has been a good option as we're kind of getting our education programming started. It is fairly user-friendly to use and fairly cheap, but we're also kind of in the process of also looking for other options. So we're definitely not like sold on it.
Yeah, I think a lot of tool libraries nationally use sites like Eventbrite or Meetup. Some people use GiveButter to host enrollment. So yeah, lots of options, but you just need to find what works best for you and meets your needs. So after you've posted your workshop, you can't really expect people to sign up for it without marketing. So we all know the power of marketing. You've got to figure out how you can tell people that you have what they want. But marketing can be pretty complex, and it's a huge time suck. So when you're thinking about marketing, consider your brand identity. And this may sound overwhelming, but it's important that you present a recognizable and cohesive organization to participants. And this might mean like having brand colors or a mascot or just a go-to style that gets communicated across all of your marketing. Along with that, having a marketing strategy, maybe not high level, but at least a general strategy that allows you to be consistent with your posting, allows you to understand your community needs so that you can stay in sync with them, and to help you market all aspects of your organization while not overwhelming viewers with competing events or programs. Nobody likes to get too many emails. It's definitely something we are working on here. And then also you want to consider your marketing avenues. So do you send an email newsletter? Do you use social media? Do you have community outreach days or table at events, etc., or all of the above? A big thing to consider here, again, like we keep saying, is the people power element. You might need to hire somebody whose job it is to handle marketing. Maybe it's you have a dedicated graphic designer so that all of your imagery can stay consistent. Maybe you have a social media coordinator, or maybe even a community liaison who handles how your organization is being represented in public. So along with someone dedicated to marketing, you also need real people to offer administrative support to your participants. Unfortunately, AI isn't quite good enough to know the ins and outs of your organization, enough to field every type of question that you will receive from your members. Answering emails is a big part of my day-to-day, and I've developed systems to handle like quickly answering these enrollment issues and questions about classes, etc. But you can never solve for the human condition, and people will definitely have a lot of questions.
So as you're going forward with creating an education program, the next part of the recipe that we've kind of determined is the assessment component. We mentioned assessment a little bit earlier on how to determine what your community needs are in relation to education programming. But here we're going to be talking about the assessment of the programs that you've created and determining how things are going and if anything needs to be changed going forward. These are the processes that you'll want to consider while your programs are already up and running to continue to improve them and make sure the work that you're doing is paying off. Because of that, these are going to be ongoing processes that will never be perfect or done, but they'll always be informing you of the changing needs of your membership base. So a good place to start for these is to gather information from your community about your classes. And this can be in the form of, like Jen mentioned earlier, surveys. We do some post-class surveys, general surveys, or open forums where people can submit questions or comments about our classes. These can give us a variety of information and might highlight some repetitive themes or questions that are going to be coming up and maybe even easily addressable from us. They can also be one-on-ones, which these can be debriefs after classes, and these can happen with teachers or students. And it can also be a part of evaluating teachers' performances. I know at Station North, they do an annual teacher check-in where you can give feedback and also get feedback from your teachers, which is probably a good way to like stay involved with your classes. Student retention is another good way to gather information about your classes. Just seeing if people are coming back for more classes after they're taking one. If you have programs where there's multiple steps, are people signing up for the first one and then the second one, things like that. It can give you information about like where your students are at and seeing if the classes are working for them. And as you're gathering all this info, it's good to have questions in mind and ask questions during it. And then this can help you determine if you're meeting your goals that you've made for these programs. These questions can be focused around like how to adapt, grow, and sustain these programs, how to make changes that you want to make to the curriculum or changes to the system processes that you have, or how you're archiving these processes and how to create and archive more things along the way. And once you've gathered your information, you'll need to measure the impact of the programs that you're creating. So measuring the impact can be really difficult and might rely on some of the processes of gathering information, like we just mentioned, like surveys or one-on-ones or things like that. But consider how these programs are impacting your community. And this can be how are they leading to community growth and like what type of growth they're providing. Is it all individual? Is it more community-based, skill-based, things like that? Is there a direct community or personal impact? So are people using the skills that they've learned in the library and borrowing more tools from you to that include the skills that they've learned? Or are they wanting to share their skills with other community members? Like if people have been around for a while and signing up for orientations, now do they want to host open hours in their workshop or teach orientation classes in the workshop, things like that. And a big thing is how are you going to measure these impacts? This can be really complicated information to gather, and you might measure it in your membership demographics or a growth in membership in general, or perhaps in attendance to these additional programs. Like we mentioned earlier, you can use the data on student retention or feedback to help inform the impact that you're making and inform places that you might want to consider making changes. The last part of this kind of circle that feeds on itself is like, how are you going to create the changes that you have determined that you might want to do? There is going to be a big labor need for creating any changes as well, just as like setting up these processes is. And who is going to be doing this? Is it going to be staff? Is it going to be volunteers? Is it going to be instructors? Like these are all things to consider as you're making changes. And who's going to be writing down all the processes that you're doing and all the changes that you're making to these. And some other things to consider in the creating changes is just like, how are you allowing new facilitators to come on board and new instructors to come on board, things like that. You don't want to be repeating your work all the time. So it's best to like be able to write it down and have it very clear and concise for the next people who are coming on board.
We're back here with money. Unfortunately, money is a big variable when it comes to the recipe of creating successful programming. Even if your hope is to offer free workshops, there's most likely going to be an initial investment when starting your educational programming. But that being said, there's a lot of thrifty ways to steer clear of expensive classes. So look to your values and to decide how money will interact with this programming. I feel like we're going in circles a lot with like what we talk about, but it all kind of feeds into itself. Look at your values. What are your goals? What's your mission? Maybe you get grants to fund all these classes and staff time. Or maybe you charge for classes because you want to be self-sufficient. A big consideration, again, is how do you value people power and how do you value labor? So your staffing structure may reflect that, and it will inform you what your financial needs are. So I just also want to mention here that this recipe as a whole is variable and non-sequential. Many libraries have started educational programming without having all of the answers to these questions or all of the money to start to have their initial investment. But we do recommend that you consider all of these layers beforehand. It might lessen any double work that might come up or miscommunications, and it will definitely help you steer clear of ill-advised investments.